Good morning, Matthew. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you about tourism and biodiversity and what tourism can do to help biodiversity to survive in a more and more hostile world. For those of you who don't know Matthew was head of conservation at the Zoological Society of London, and he's also chair now of the advisory board for the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology, which is actually where my work on conservation was based way back in the 90s, but then I am an old man. Matthew, tell us how you think tourism can contribute to the future of biodiversity in this planet.
Well, thanks first of all, Harold, for inviting me to join this series of blogs. I'm happy to talk to you on this issue. And pre-COVID, the answer to your question was very straightforward and remains quite straightforward in a sense, in that protected areas, national parks all over the developing world have benefited from the income from tourism for decades at this point. And obviously, that's a complex relationship. And maybe we'll have a little bit of time to talk about pros and as well as cons as well as pros. No, and by and large, obviously it's an advantageous relationship for the protected areas themselves, because without the financial support that tourism brings with it, a lot of them would have a very hard time existing.
So I think as you say, the pros are fairly obvious. What are the problems with it though?
Well, any protected area has a certain carrying capacity based on the infrastructure that's there for tourists, and a lot of the time, based on the size of the protected area. A very small one, is likely to have a lower carrying capacity than a very large one. But infrastructure is important as well. If you've got a very large protected area with no footpath network or with no visitor infrastructure, then it's going to have a lower carrying capacity than a large one that's got all those advantages.
One of the problems I've seen though, and particularly when I worked in India, was the way in which people congregate around. So in theory, in the tiger reserves in India, the tourists are not supposed to harass the tigers, but of course as soon as one is spotted, all the jeeps descend upon the one example, and you wonder where on earth they find the privacy to mate or bring up young.
Yes, and you get the same thing in Africa with lions and cheetahs. Everyone's on the same radio frequency, and so the moment there's a sighting, everybody flocks to see it. And the way that has been managed with mountain gorillas, for example, in Rwanda and DRC, is that the number of visitors to see the habituated gorilla groups every day is strictly rationed, strictly controlled, and the cost is correspondingly high, because obviously the governments, the protected area networks, look to maximize their revenues. When it comes to the large cats, it's a tricky issue. I mean, ultimately, I would say it's up to the individual protected area managers to make sure that a balance is maintained. And what you might decide is that within a certain zone of a park, you allow that kind of concentration of tourists around individual animals, but if you can maintain another 80% of the park where animals can go about their normal behaviors undisturbed, then maybe that's a trade-off that's worthwhile.
Yes, and that assumes, of course, that the wildlife has the opportunity to migrate away from those areas where the tourists are in large numbers.
Indeed, and yeah, that's another issue, which is in Africa in particular, protected areas that were once parts of continuous areas of forest or savanna,
Yeah.
extending hundreds of miles, are now islands surrounded by humanity. And that's going to be an increasing problem in the future.
So Matthew, you were head of conservation at the Zoological Society of London. How do you see the role of zoos in this?
Okay, again, so thinking pre-COVID, zoos, I think, have got an incredibly important part to play in conservation. First of all, as windows on wildlife. Obviously, with television and international travel, the role of zoos has had to change substantially over the last 100 years or so. But nonetheless, a tremendous number of people working in conservation today got their original inspiration from a zoo visit. And so that immediacy, that sense of what it smells, what it's like to smell a tiger or to smell a gorilla, you only get that with the real animal there. You don't get that on television. Zoos also are playing an important role when it comes to breeding up populations of species that are sometimes extinct in the wild, so that they can be reintroduced. There are several quite well-known examples of that now. And zoos like ZSL in London, but also the Bronx Zoo in New York and other zoos around the world, often now have their own programs where they're running field projects to protect animals, wildlife in situ in places like Madagascar, Africa, Asia, pretty much all over the world at this point.
Do you know very much about what's happening at Harlots and Portland? Because I understand that there are efforts there to relocate some of those animals back into the wild and to rewild.
Yes, yeah, indeed. So when I met my wife, partly thanks to the Harlots program in Congo, where originally they were, they had a facility to rehabilitate orphaned gorillas that had been confiscated from traffickers, and then to reintroduce them to, or first of all to socialize them in groups, and then to reintroduce them to the wild. And that was an enormously important service for conservation, actually, because you get a lot of confiscated animals, and unless you've got some kind of plan as to what to do with them once they've been confiscated, otherwise, it's a pretty bleak kind of outlook. What's happened to that program now is that they are taking gorillas that were actually born here in Kent, either at Howlett or at Port Lim, and reintroducing them to the wild, which is remarkable that's now possible, although it's a very costly undertaking. And frankly, because there are already so many Western lowland gorillas in Central Africa, that money might be better spent actually focusing back on the original problem, which is the confiscated animals.
What about the welfare issues in zoos, Matthew?
Zoos invest, I think, probably at this stage, hundreds of thousands of pounds in ensuring the welfare of the animals in their care. It's a very tricky issue, though. On the one hand, nobody in a zoo wants the animals in their care to be mistreated in any way. Most of the people working in zoos are there, or none of them are there for the money. Most of them are there because of their love of animals. At the same time, as our understanding of different species has evolved, we've realized that, keeping polar bears, for example, which would, in the wild range over hundreds of miles in captivity, is extremely difficult without them developing the kinds of repetitive behaviors that, those of us of a certain age have certainly seen with polar bears. But, the same goes for elephants. And I think, an awful lot of zoos are having to make quite difficult decisions now about animals that previously were their bread and butter.
Yeah.
And so London Zoo, for example, hasn't had elephants now for quite a few years because they simply don't have the space for them. They don't have polar bears, but there's a cost to that in terms of visitor numbers. A lot of people used to go to zoos to see elephants, and so zoos are always trying to strike a balance between fulfilling their charitable missions, contributing to conservation, but at the same time remaining viable financially as visitor attractions, which means having animals in their collections that the public wants to see.
I had an interesting experience at Kana when I was tour leading. We'd booked into Kana, the Indian tiger reserve there for 3 days to get to know the environment and hopefully to see a tiger. And all the guides had radios, and often those radios are used to make sure that you don't meet a tiger on your first trip out on the back of an elephant, as you could in those days.
Yes. Yeah.
And unfortunately, first trip out, we saw a tiger, and the whole group saw the same tiger, which meant we got another 2 days of sightseeing to do in the park, and we'd already seen the tiger. The consequence of this mismanagement, frankly, by the guide, was that they were under pressure to find us more and more intimate images and experiences of the tiger. It was a disaster. And in a way, I think Attenborough's films have also encouraged that. The assumption that you ought to be able to go and see actually quite rare and intimate behavior amongst animals has been generated by the fact you can see it on your big screen in your front room at home.
Okay, that's true, but I was astounded visiting national parks and tiger reserves in India because you could pass elephants, you could pass also wild peacocks, you could pass all sorts of fascinating wildlife, but they were so focused on showing us tigers that they basically ignored the other species. And to me, that's a mistake because, there's so much to be said about, so many other species. Leopards, my God.
Very hard to see, of course.
Very hard to see, but lots of stories to be told. Lots of stories to be told about human-wildlife conflict. The relationship between tigers, leopards, and humans in that particular environment, where you've got a very strong cultural, religious framework that of the belief system that is that translates over into the way that the wildlife department manages human wildlife conflict is absolutely remarkable, and especially for visitors coming in from overseas. I guess for people visiting within India, it's a little different, but there are whole stories to tell about that relationship and about the sanctuaries that are set up as to try and deal with the phenomenon of problem animals.
So Matthew, would I be putting words unacceptably into your mouth if I was to suggest that the tourist is actually being robbed of the more interesting possibilities of their experience, where the focus is just on catching a glimpse of the charismatic megafauna and not seeing the environment in its whole and its relationship with us as people?
I guess I wouldn't go quite so far as that, because I've never been in the position of trying to make my living out of tourism. And if 90% of the visitors to any one park are there because of one species, I guess I would do the same thing as them. But at the same time, the complexity of these environments and the sheer range of issues that are going on in any one landscape in terms of how humans relate to it, the history of the landscape, the relationship between the geology and the vegetation and the species, the interactions between the species. A lot of the time it's a question of how the guides have been trained and
also how they're managed.
And how they're managed.
One of my best ever wildlife experiences was when a guide was desperate and couldn't find any charismatic megafauna for us to see, and took therefore to showing us the insects, and then took us to see a graveyard within the national park, which was a traditional African graveyard, which I would not have seen had I not had an expert guide. But that was one of the most interesting experiences I'd had. And I didn't see a lion, an elephant, a rhino, or anything really take a photograph of, except the burial ground and some insects. But it was a fascinating afternoon, and I think there is something to be said for actually encouraging the guides and rewarding them for doing their guiding in a slightly different way.
Yeah, I spent 6 years in Madagascar, and obviously, if you go to Madagascar as a tourist, or for an awful lot of tourists, they go there for the wildlife, and so the guides at the national park that I helped set up in the northeast of the country were trained primarily to interpret the wildlife and to find the tiny little thumbnail size chameleons that without their expertise
you wouldn't find.
Nobody else would find. But at the same time, I think it was a bit of a revelation to them that people coming in from abroad were ultimately as interested to learn about the Malagasy Fadi beliefs, taboos, and the kinds of insights that guides can provide that tourists aren't going to get at their average hotel or lodge. Is absolutely invaluable. And that there was a particular dimension to this park in Madagascar, because European sailors had anchored offshore on their way from Europe to the Spice Islands at the end of the 16th and beginning of the 17th century, and had left traces of their passing. They scratched messages in a rock, and just the stories to tell around that are unbelievable.
I think the educational opportunities of this kind of tourism are often underplayed and undervalued, and yet presumably there's a big opportunity for tourism to contribute to people's understanding of the complexity of the environment around us. Indeed,
and there are massive differences, obviously, to the kinds of landscapes that people are seeing in Africa and Asia. But I don't know, there's a for those of us living in Europe, a little bit less in North America, but for Europe, one of the fascinations of a European landscape is that if you know a little bit about plants and architecture and geology, you can look at a landscape and get a sense of why it looks the way it does. Yes. And the more you understand about vegetation and so on, actually in places like Madagascar, a lot of places in Asia, you can do exactly the same thing. And having a guide who can kind of peel off those different levels of what you're seeing for you is just a revelation.
Well, let's hope that tourism begins to do that better. Matthew, thank you very much for your time this morning. It's very much appreciated. Lots to think on from what you've said.
Well, thanks, Harold. Pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you.